Auburn, yes, that Auburn is the hottest recruiting team in the country right now. Zac Blackerby of Locked On Auburn here to discuss it. Why is this important at this point in time?
I think there's an interesting power balance that's happening within the Southeastern Conference. And also, like, what does the future of recruiting even look like? So what's happening in the state of Alabama is something that we've never seen before, because it's been run by Nick Saban, especially in the recruiting front. And we're in a situation right now, Spencer, where Alabama is in a spot to not land any of the top 10 players in the state for the first time ever. I mean, think about that, which is weird because when you look at the recruiting rankings, Alabama's number 2. And so to me, it's like, is Alabama and Kalen DeBoer opening up the door to the future of recruiting where it doesn't matter where your university is? It's very strange. It's very strange. But obviously what Auburn's doing is they're doing something they've never done before. And Auburn's been able to compete for championships without having top recruiting classes. Now they're number 5, according to 247, in the 2025 recruiting class. Then after adding 1 million commits to the 2026 class over the course of the weekend, Big Cat weekend, they're number 1 in the 2026 class. So Hugh Freeze did this at Ole Miss. Obviously, there's an asterisk next to it. Now it's free for all. You can do whatever you want. And so with all that, Auburn is one of the hottest, if not the hottest team when it comes to recruiting in all of college football, Spencer. And so to me, like, we've seen Auburn play spoiler. We've seen Auburn kind of be this dynamic and dramatic team with top 10 recruiting classes. Not bad, but man, imagine if they're consistently in the top 5. I think it gets pretty interesting.
The Alabama component is fascinating to me because
crazy to me.
In a state that has a high level for its population of blue chip talent every single year, to your point, that's been Nick Saban's territory. It's not Kalen DeBoer's yet. I'm curious to see how long that lasts, Zach, and whether it's just a 2025 thing or if it continues, because DeBoer is proving people wrong right now for those who doubted whether he'd be able to recruit. Well, he didn't do it at Washington. Is he going to do it here? Mm-hmm. Those questions have been pretty squarely answered at this point in time. So how sustainable is that run specifically on in-state recruiting for Auburn and Hugh Freeze?
Yeah, and a lot of these are West Coast commits, and he already had relationships with them. What happens when you're recruiting California consistently, over the course of a few years, and it's like, well, on Friday nights and you got a home game, like, you can't just go up and see them. You can drive over to Birmingham if you're in Tuscaloosa. You can drive to Huntsville and go and see them. That's why Auburn's prioritizing Birmingham and Mobile, because you can make that trip. You can leave the office at lunch on Friday and go watch all of these recruits and get back, for last minute game planning stuff for the next day. That's pretty standard. It's pretty normal. But the other component to this is, like, when you look at the top 10 players in the state of Alabama this year, 8-ish, depending on which metric you look at, are committed to Auburn. The other 2, Spencer, talking about, like, does location even matter anymore if this is what the future is? Ohio State. Ohio State has the other one. Naeem Offord, who I know you're familiar with, and Oregon certainly in the race for him. But it's just an interesting component. Like, everything has just become so fluid in college football, where we talk about the transfer portal and players having all this power and coaches moving to take other jobs. Well, I think it's kind of trickled down to high school recruiting now. It's just an interesting phenomenon right now that we're seeing. But as far as Auburn executing at a high level right now, they went into the weekend ranked around the 15th class in the country, depending on where you looked. Now they're as high as 5. There's some real momentum that Hugh Freeze is building.
Well, another aspect of that kind of different world of recruiting is it's a more connected world. Everyone became really familiar, if they weren't already, with how to use Zoom or how to talk to people when you can't go see them in person. But just the evolution of technology and social media has made it easier than ever to figure out who a kid is, find out whether you want him, see his film, and then get in touch with him. Like, it's never been easier than it is now. I mean, you'll have some kids who, in their Twitter bios will put their email or phone number and say, contact me here. And I think that does translate to brands being able to go outside a certain geographic footprint that they're accustomed to recruiting very well for, Ohio State going down into the state of Alabama, or Oregon recruit. I was talking about this with Brian Smith, our Locked On Recruiting Insider, on today's episode of Locked On Ducks. Oregon going into Ohio and potentially landing Trey McNutt, who's committing this weekend, or the idea of getting Naeem Offord, who's from the state of Alabama. Like, it feels like those moves, or Alabama specifically going into the state of California for a kid like Bryce Young, that didn't happen in the early 2000s or even the early 2010s as often, but now it does.
Yeah, I think you can still build those relationships, but when it comes time to where you're going to make your family travel to come see you, I do think you're going to start to see some components. And I think we've seen this a little bit this recruiting cycle when USC had all of these kids that were committed from the Southeast committed to them. Yeah. And now you're starting slowly, one by one, they're all flipping or decommitting over the course of, the past few months. And I mean, we're going to see this with the ACC and with the Big Ten, where, these ACC schools, they're going to have to go travel to, out west to some of these new schools, or what's going to happen when Oregon has to travel to Rutgers on a normal basis. It's just, it's interesting. Like, you can say it's fluid, but when you're asking your family to say, hey, if you want to come see me, and you're Naeem Offord, and you say, okay, fam, I built a relationship with these folks that live in Ohio, so come on.
Yeah.
It's a lot. It's a big ask.
It is.
And like some of the examples you just said, like even with Bryce Young, like a lot of these situations, like they move. It's such a good opportunity. They move. Like they move from California to Alabama to, support their kid and be able to see them and help with their career. Not everybody can do that. And so it's going to be interesting to see how many of these stick when it matters in December, when early signing day rolls around.
What should the rest of the SEC take away from this recruiting heater from Auburn? And also, for those who aren't aware, who has Auburn gotten? Why is it such a big buzz for the Tigers right now? And what message are they sending to the Lane Kiffins, Kalen DeBoers, and Kirby Smarts of the world with regards to their ability to acquire talent?
Yeah, well, once again, I think Auburn has been able to overachieve in some of these championship runs that they've had. I mean, 2010, obviously Cam Newton helped. And who did they beat? Who did they win the national championship against, Spencer? I just want to bring that up real quick.
I feel like
2013, I mean, that wasn't a top 10 roster, right? 2017, when they were a game away from the college football playoff and beat two number one teams in 3 weeks with Georgia and Alabama, that wasn't a top 5, top 10 roster. And all of a sudden you look at like, okay, well, what did Hugh Freeze do with the worst roster that he will have in his Auburn tenure? I mean, he put that roster together last year with duct tape in the span of 2 months, thanks to the transfer portal, and got all these guys that had played elsewhere and put together an okay roster. And it took everything from Georgia and Alabama to win at Jordan-Hare Stadium. It just, I just think when you look at what Auburn's been able to do historically throughout the SEC, they're a tough out. They're a tough out for these top teams. I mean, look at one of the best teams that we've ever seen with Joe Burrow's LSU team. I mean, it took everything inside of them to beat Auburn that year. And so I just think if you put Hugh Freeze against all of these other top teams with a top 5 roster, which they finished with the 8th recruiting class last year, they're going to finish top 5 this year if all things happen the way that I think that they will. In 2026 right now, they're at number 1. Will they slip and other people add commits? Sure. But I still think they're in a great spot to have a top 5 class when it's all said and done. But if you do that 3 years in a row with the transfer portal and how fluid everything is, and you get the right quarterback, you've probably got a top 5 roster. And just Auburn has never had that before. So the fact that they've been able to compete without having top 10 rosters, and they're about to have a top 5 roster in the next 2 or 3 years, I do think that should be concerning if you're a team that plays Auburn on a regular basis.
When you mentioned that fateful day in Glendale in 2011, I felt like one of those guys being interviewed by the FBI in The Wolf of Wall Street. Sorry, I have no recollection of that. I don't recall. No, yeah, I don't. Sure. I don't recall because I do not. I do recall.
Dyer wasn't down, so you got that.
I knew that was going to get out there eventually. I might edit that out of the segment later. We'll just have to wait and see. But
next to Seth Williams on that back shoulder throw too.
Zach Blackerby logged on Auburn. I'm just straight kicking it. You know, we like to keep our segments 8 to 10 minutes, so it's time. The trumpet,
time to go.
Yeah. The orchestra's playing. Time to move off the stage here. Zac Blackerby locked on Auburn. Many would say the best Zac here at the network. You're going to get to decide though, because we've got Zach Seiko locked on Penn State coming up next.
Ask him about Alvin Henderson.
Okay, I will do that. I'll be honest, I don't know what that means, but I'm going to ask him about it
He flipped
anyway.
from Penn State to Auburn like a month ago. It's a bit.
Okay, we might lead with that, you know, if I want that Zach to not like me. But we're going to answer this question. What is the biggest question for Penn State in 2024? Number one, most important thing to look for. That's coming up next.